Oftentimes if we laid out, toil, no danger fearing, tugging out the flapping sail to the weather rearing. Long we've tossed on the rolling main, now we're safe ashore, Jack.
Live from the Connecticut River Museum in Essex, we're here to talk about shipwrecks. Let's hear it from... We have 1,700 people here today, crammed into a very small space. Did anybody bring a suction dredge? Anybody have in the car a suction dredge? That's going to limit some of our abilities to do some of the things we wanted to do. We're kind of hoping maybe somebody would have one. So we're going to be talking today about shipwrecks, and we're going to define that term kind of broadly, too. We're going to define it to include, at the end, the remains of Native American dugout canoes, for example, that are found in freshwater in Connecticut. But we've got a lot to talk about here in Essex, and to talk about those things, well, we could start with a very old friend of mine. Not that he's very old, but we've known each other a long time. We're both very old at this point. Nick Bellantoni, he's emeritus Connecticut state archaeologist who's investigated shipwrecks in Long Island Sound and the Connecticut River. Christopher Goodwin is president and CEO of R. Christopher Goodwin and Associates, which was contracted by the State Historic Preservation Office to survey shipwrecks along the Connecticut coast. Kevin McBride, University of Connecticut archaeology professor specializing in the Native American history of Connecticut and former director of research at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. So I think we should start. We're sitting here in this beautiful museum that is very, very close to the biggest maritime losses suffered by the American side in the War of 1812. So we should just talk a little bit about this. And Kevin, maybe just give us the backstory. So it was actually 1814, right, that the British came here to cause mayhem.
Yeah, correct. Probably in the spring of 1814. They sent a number of ships launches up here with about 150 Marines and sailors to destroy shipping in retaliation for essentially asymmetrical warfare being conducted on the British warships that were patrolling the Sound.
No, asymmetrical. Well, I mean, basically, I always feel like in the history of Connecticut in those early years, if you could get some money out of it, you could get people a lot more interested in fighting. So we had privateers here, right? They had letters of marque where they could go and seize British ships and sell them at auction.
They did, but in this context, the U.S. government, in its wisdom, decided one of the best ways to bring the war to the British was they'd offered a bounty for anybody who could sink a British warship, and they would give them half the worth. So you can imagine every person who had a boat or an idea along the Connecticut coast was sending fire ships, torpedoes, etc., out to try and sink these British warships. And they came close a couple of times.
It was sort of early lotto. It was before Powerball.
Exactly.
If you could launch a Powerball into a boat and sink it, you could get some money. So what we wind up with is this raid where 25 boats, at least, American boats, were burned.
28.
28, wow. Yeah.
Most of those were actually salvaged later.
So they burned them. They seized 2 privateers, right?
The Anaconda, and I can't remember the other ship's name.
Does anybody have it at the tip of their tongue? Because I think I can come up with it here. The Eagle. That is correct. Who said the Eagle?
Amy,
all right, you win some kind of award. Yeah. I don't know what. So, Nick, one of the things, after something like this, obviously there's some good places to look for the remains of these ships. But let's say I'm dredging around or something and I pull some hunk of wood up. I mean, how do you figure out whether you can tie some fragment of a boat to something like what happened here in 1814?
Well, that's very difficult. I mean, it depends on how diagnostic the elements are. Like a knee, an L-shaped wood to help secure the deck to the ribs was uncovered here, found in the water here that had been charred. Mm-hmm. So the idea, one suggestion was that maybe it might have been one of the vessels that had been burnt here, but it's very hard to authenticate that. You find a lot of things, but you do the best you can in terms of what science could be done and the history behind it. But often very difficult to isolate a single artifact and put it toward one historic event.
Right. So one of my favorite things about the timeline that they have here at the River Museum is so the British raiding party, they come up, and I think it's like 3:30 in the morning, and they burn some boats, and then the light comes up, and they can see more boats to burn. And they burn all these boats, and then they're like retreating downward. And at one point, the American commander gave them the opportunity to surrender. And they're like, "No, we don't think so. Actually, we just burned like all of your boats, basically, and then stole the rest. No, we're not surrendering. That's not going to happen." So, Chris, I know that you've done. I mean, we're in the second segment. We're going to talk a lot about some of the exploration you've done out in the Sound. Have you been looking around the area here for some of the remains of these boats?
So, that's the question, right?
Right.
Where did those vessels go? Is there anything left of them? The answer is that they probably, as Kevin said, were largely salvaged. Think about it, 1814, metal artifacts, what we'd call artifacts today, were very rare, took a long time to make them. Good ship timbers, if it could be recycled, would be used to recycle. But what Kevin didn't say, and I know he knows because I got it out of his report for the Battlefield Protection Outfit, was that the British also burned everything that they didn't carry away out of the shipyards here in Essex. So they walked off with cordage and naval stores, everything that was useful to them, and then they burned the shipyards and the factories and the work sheds and destroyed the shipwrights' tools, which I think probably put a higher premium on salvage of the vessels. We surveyed the whole river all the way down to Old Lyme, and didn't see anything that would indicate that any of the ships are in the river. We found a lot of other interesting stuff. We could see every pier and dock that has subsided into the water over the years, tires that were used to protect vessels at those docks. But there was no magnetometer targets that would indicate any concentrations of metal. So if there are timbers out there, they have no magnetic signature. Mm-hmm. We couldn't image them in side scan sonar, so they're subsided below the sediment in the river. But I think it also should be pointed out that the area immediately behind this fine museum was basically made land, and the old piers sit right behind us here. And back in the 1890s, 1980s rather, there were some. It's a problem with archaeologists. We mess up time. There was some archaeology done back there, and the original piers were located. And so I think it's also possible there may be some remnants of those vessels behind us inside the last terrace of the old Connecticut River Channel.
So, Nick, he just used the word "it's possible," and I think that's a word that archaeologists wind up having to use a lot. For example, in 2011, there were some nets dragging for sturgeon here in the river. They did come up with some old wood that could conceivably maybe be from the young Anaconda or one of those boats, but that's another "it's possible" kind of thing.
Well, you're talking in this case with that knee that came up is basically an isolated find.
Yeah.
What it would take is
It wasn't
a
an
good
actual
archaeological
knee.
exploration.
You should probably point out that it wasn't an actual knee. It was like
No, that's right. It's a piece of wood. We call it a knee from the vessel. It kept the deck together from the attached to the ribbing. But yeah, it would take more of an archaeological investigation, a full scale, going down in the area and recovering as much information as possible. So we never say impossible, but a lot of times the things we find are far more mundane than, the more exciting historic events that we like to think of.
Right. So in his old office, Nick had a very large collection of the other kinds of knees, which he would have been happy to show you. So Kevin, since we're here in Essex, and so Essex does this thing every year, they have this Losers' Day parade where they reflect upon and acknowledge this enormous naval loss, really the biggest naval loss of that war. And there's also this kind of idea that has been around that maybe Essex didn't put up much of a fight. And we should say that one of the things is, as the British came in off the Sound, they thought they were going to have to take a fort right there, down there in Old Saybrook. I think there's nobody there in the fort, so that was not a big problem. But there has been some rethinking of this, right? There's been some finds that maybe suggest that somebody did put up a fight during those hours.
There was, in fact, the Americans did respond, maybe not quickly. I think the local militias in Essex sort of basically decided it was in their best interest to retreat after the British fired a few volleys at them from their launches. But overnight, as you pointed out, this started at 3 a.m. By morning, regular Army, Marines, probably sailors from Fort Trumbull and local militias actually established several gun emplacements, and they, gave the British a pretty hard time as they were going back downriver and had mild success.
Two dead, 2 injured, we think.
Yeah. It wasn't a lot, but
Right.
it sounded good.
Yeah, they gave him a little bit of a fight anyway. It's not a happy story, and there's no way we can spin it that way. So I think maybe we can segue from that a little bit just to have a sense of, Chris, maybe I can start with you. I think of the Connecticut River as this place where if I were to walk into the river at Chester, we have a state representative from Chester here in the audience, I could probably walk pretty far out into the river before it went over my head. But it was not ever thus, right? In other words, during a lot of the periods we'll be talking about today, this was a deep water river that a deep water boat could go up and down.
Also, there are areas that are deeper now than there were then, and just below Essex there was a fairly major marsh island that's not there anymore. So the rivers are changeable, and the channels move. Obviously, when we're talking about vintage War of 1812, there wasn't a lot of active channel maintenance and not a lot of private dredging, and so rivers are very fluid environments. Up by Everton, where it comes into the river, there's a piece of a bridge that came down in a storm in the water. So the channels migrate, shoals develop, and rivers move around.
And Nick, I think it's a thing we tend to forget that, if you go to some of the wonderful exhibits that are right here in this building, you'll see these steamships. I think they're screw-driven steamships that could carry 350 people. There were big boats doing river commerce in this river, probably starting when? Maybe around 1825, something like that.
Yes, going up and down, the traffic here would have been enormous. But also, not only the ship traffic, but also the shipbuilding. There were many shipbuilding enterprises going all the way up Hartford and all the way down, all along the coast. And a lot of those, we've seen are probably has some minor archaeological visibility, but very deeply stratified now under a lot of silt and so forth. And like Chris said, the river meanders, it moves around, at least north of Middletown, and then it gets like a fjord when it gets down here. There's not much movement, but up further, it really moved around. But a lot of shipbuilding, a lot of traffic. These vessels were the highways.
Yeah, and Kevin, maybe you can also extend our thinking about that out into the Sound. I picture Long Island Sound as being full of navigation hazards, like boulders and stuff in there. What's it like on the bottom of the Sound, and what kind of hazards did that present to ships?
There's a number of hazards, and the bottom varies quite a bit. If you look at the logbooks, British logbooks for the British raid on Essex and the Battle of Stonington, they're constantly taking soundings because the bottom was so unpredictable, and there was a lot of unreported reefs and shoals and things of that nature. Connecticut River is quite unique, and it's the only major river in the United States without a large city at its mouth. And that's because of the sandbars and the shoals that sort of prevented that. So the shipping did go up and down here quite a bit and into the Sound, but it was always, you needed a local pilot and, with almost daily knowledge.
I want to talk a little bit, Chris, about the survey that you got hired to do after Storm Sandy. I don't know why the storm occasioned this, but there was certainly an interest in knowing what kind of shipwrecks there were down there.
And also trying to assess the damage of a cyclonic storm on important shipwreck sites. And it was all part of the Hurricane Sandy Relief Act, which gave money to all of the federal agencies, including the National Park Service, which then doled out research funds to the various state historic preservation offices. And one of the missions that we had for the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office was to do remote sensing surveys in areas that had previously recorded shipwrecks that were important historically to the maritime history of Connecticut. It was a seafaring state, and it remains such now, like out of New London for the Navy, and goes way back. I got fascinated in Stonington, where Kevin hails from, with the phenomenal history of ship captains like Nathaniel Brown Palmer, after whom Palmer Land, Palmer Peninsula, Palmer Archipelago, and so on in Antarctica are named, because he was the first American to see them in 1820 on a sealing expedition. Stonington became a port of trade and got a customs house in 1842. Captain Palmer was the co-inventor, if you will, of the clipper ships, and he sailed to Hong Kong in 111 days out of Stonington. Pretty cool. And so that history, that maritime focus, that maritime history was ubiquitous across the coast of Connecticut. And as Nick mentioned, the shipbuilding industries along the Connecticut River, Chester that I know, well, that you know, Essex, Middletown. Middletown made a lot of boats. And so the whole history of maritime endeavor has representation archaeologically in the shipwrecks of the rivers and along the Long Island Sound. So our endeavor was to select areas of high probability for shipwreck sites and do remote sensing surveys. We started with proton magnetometer, cesium gradiometer, and side scan sonar surveys, and then we identified a lot of shipwrecks. And then we went back with a next generation technology called multi-beam echo sounder, which allows us to do precise measurements and render the shipwrecks in 3 dimensions, and took a detailed look at 17 of those shipwrecks. And we've written a report and recommended creation of an underwater archaeological district in Fisher's Island Sound, National Register nomination of several of the steamships that you were talking about, and got a really neat picture, if you will, of the evolution of shipping, although we didn't find any of those early canoes that Kevin's familiar with from Mashantucket Pequot, Nick is familiar with, because they don't have the kinds of signatures that one would pick up in the remote sensing array. No metal.
Right. What we're going to do right now is take a quick break here. I'm getting some anxious signals from the team over there. We're going to grab a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some very specific ships, boats, and Kevin's also going to tell us quite a bit more about some of the Native American finds out there. So let's take a quick break. We're here at the Connecticut River Museum. We'll be right back.
Is down I'll mean to roam, for I'm a river driver and I'm far away from home.
All right, we're live from the Connecticut River Museum in beautiful Essex with a wonderful audience, an audience of thousands here today. I'm not going to restate all their credentials, but with us are Nick Bellantoni, Christopher Goodwin, Kevin McBride, about as expert a panel as you could possibly have for a conversation like this one. So, I want to sort of pick up where we left off, but I think it's sort of maybe useful to talk about very specific finds, specific ships. So, Chris, as you do this inventory of these kind of almost undersea, underwater graveyards of ships, you find all kinds of things, but just maybe let's pick one that's of interest. Tell us about the Isabel.
Okay, so the Isabel was a steamship with a walking beam engine. It was made in 1894 in Noank for the A.J. Smith company out of Bridgeport. It sailed with cargo and passengers up and down Long Island Sound for 21 years until it hit a rock on the evening of September 28, 1915. And that rock tore a hole in the hull, and she rapidly began to take on water. And Captain George Rowland intentionally beached the steamer on Cow Reef to keep it from sinking, but hopes of floating it the following day were dashed by a heavy storm event, and down she went. NOAA, which maps the seabed routinely, came up with a postulated location for the Isabel. Back in those days, we used something called LORAN-C, which was based on fixed radio waves, land-based radio waves. Now we have GPS satellites. So we found the Isabel not where it was expected. It was a fortuitous find in an adjacent area, about a half of a nautical mile away, and located it with both a magnetometer because it was a steamship. It had a lot of metal, and got some images of it with the side scan sonar. And then in order to assess its condition and see what was left, we went back with the multi-beam echo sounder, which gave us marvelous three-dimensional renderings.
Chris, I think some people are listening and going, magnetometer, GPS, sonar, what about just diving down there and taking a look at it? Kevin, maybe you can give people a sense of what visibility is like if you're diving down looking for something in Long Island Sound.
Close your eyes. That's all you got to do.
It's like if you put your arm out in front of you, can you see?
Maybe 2 feet.
Maybe you can see the end of your fingers, maybe not though. So so this is one of the reasons we're using all this kind of high-tech stuff. Now, Nick, as a completely ignorant member of the public, I think, well, let's get the Isabel up there and we'll just park it over here, tie it up at the dock and here at the River Museum, and people can go look at it. But I guess it's not that easy to bring.
It's far from not that easy, but in terms of the displacement of the vessel. But you bring something out of the water now, you're responsible for it for perpetuity, and you've got to conserve and take care of these artifacts. And I've worked with a lot of wreck divers, and I go into their houses, and in their garage and basements are just full of this rotting metal that they had decided they had to take up just to prove, I guess, that they were there. And we would like to see things left in place so that they could be properly handled. But once you take something out of the water, just like in terrestrial archaeology, when you take it out of the ground, you're responsible for it, and that could be multi-million dollar into the future.
So I guess we'll be leaving the Isabel down there, Chris?
It's in really great shape. I think we've recommended that the State Historic Preservation Office determine it immediately eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. It is eligible because the entire engine and the walking beam engine is intact, the smokestack, everything is there, and it's in fabulous shape. But the metal is like a 60-ton potato chip because it's graphitized. So if you move it, you destroy it. Or, as Nick said, you spend $10, $15 million restoring it. We've done that once, and federal agencies are really the only entities that seem to have the money to be able to afford that, and they only do it in very rare occasions. Anyway, the walking beam engine that was built in Nowak in 1894 to me is particularly interesting because it's a curious, purely American invention. It was made for nearshore and inshore waters.
Was it a side paddle?
It had two side wheels.
Side wheels, okay, yeah.
That the evolution then went to propeller.
So let's talk about a few other things we're probably not ever going to get back. Nick, tell us about the old cornfield lightship. There's a model up there of, I think, a newer cornfield lightship. But
it was a lightship built at the beginning of the 20th century. Its claim to fame, it was the first lightship electrified by Thomas Edison and his company. And it served as a kind of a floating lighthouse where it would help navigation during storms. I don't know how well it worked because in 1919 it collided with a tanker and sank out in the Long Island Sound off of Old Saybrook here. And for many years there was a search for it, but it wasn't until about 15 or so years ago we were able to find it with side scanning sonar, sent divers down. It's in a very deep part of the Sound, over 90 feet down, if not more. And they were able to find the ship's bell and make a positive identification. But the side scan sonar images of that vessel are just incredible because the vessel is complete and it's laying on the bottom of the Sound on its hull, so it's standing up, so to speak.
Oh, wow.
And so you could actually, the side scan actually showed the shadows of the masts. And so pretty remarkable. It is now registered as a state archaeological preserve because of its significance.
It's also federally protected,
It's
right?
federal property. That's
so don't
exactly
go,
right.
Don't go diving down there and trying this guy over here.
That's right. No,
Because they will arrest your behind.
You can go down and enjoy it, but don't remove anything.
Right. And so we also just quickly tell us about William Gillette's Aunt Polly. This isn't William Gillette's actual Aunt Polly. I don't know where she is. She's not down. This is a boat named after her.
This was a yacht, and it was a beautiful piece, about 44 feet. And William Gillette, the prominent actor and silent movie star, famous for his portrayals of Sherlock Holmes, the first real portrayals of Sherlock Holmes at the turn of the century. He did a lot of entertaining, and he lived on the yacht. In fact, Albert Einstein was one of the people that came and shared the luxuries of this yacht. He lived in the yacht while he was building his castle up on the hill, and a term, by the way, he hated, but he was building his home up on the hill. And when he finished and moved in, very shortly thereafter, the Aunt Polly mysteriously burned at its moor. And you could still see it today if you go to the Gillette's Castle State Park, north of the Hadline Ferry that goes across the ferry. Just north of that, it's still sitting there. It is basically exposed during low tide, but completely covered with high tide. Please do not remove anything. Again, it is listed as a state archaeological preserve, but you can actually still see the Aunt Polly.
It would have been a good Sherlock Holmes mystery, what happened to the Aunt Polly. Except that it might have actually, there's a whole theory that Gillette maybe, well, there's a joke, I think, that Gillette, in order to help pay
He
for
would
the
have made
castle.
a great archaeologist, by the way.
Yeah. So, Kevin, we have to talk about, in order to explain some of the Native American exploration that you and Bob Ballard have done, I think it's important for people to understand, as I did not, what Long Island Sound was. In other words, we think of Long Island Sound as being the thing that we experience now, but the history of Long Island Sound is very different. What did it used to be?
Well, probably in the last, the end of the last glacial period, probably 15,000 years ago, it would have been a huge freshwater lake.
Yeah.
And then with rising sea level, breached the, where the Race Rock is now, and eventually the western end of Long Island Sound too. So beginning about 10,000 years ago, we began to see its development as an estuary, and then probably by 9,000, you're looking at what it was.
Yeah.
So there would have been people living all along the shores of that estuary, which could have been, thousands of meters south of the current shoreline. And there's probably thousands of archaeological sites that are now buried under the silt and sediments.
So now explain the kind of exploration that you did. I mean, at one point you were underwater for 4 days looking for stuff, right?
Yeah, we were actually exploring south of Long Island we started out using the NR-1, the Navy's smallest and deepest diving nuclear submarine. So we were out there for 3 4-day stints. Never again. And the idea was this submarine sinks to the bottom and it actually drives on truck tires. And the scientists are looking throughout portholes just about a meter above the surface. It's sort of like doing a terrestrial survey. So the idea was to look for landforms that may be intact from, 12 to 15,000 years ago that potentially could yield evidence of, early Native American sites.
Scott Breedy, the producer of this episode, is for some reason or other obsessed with the idea of you and Bob Ballard eating lean cuisines while you're underneath the water.
I got to tell you, the one thing, the food was, it is what it is. But probably the most important discovery I made on those trips is I don't think most people realize there's 8 different kinds of Klondike bars.
Oh, I was not aware of that. And only 3 of them available to the earliest Native Americans too. So I mean, give us a little bit more of a sense. I mean, obviously this is a huge, comprehensive survey or investigation. But do we know more? Do we know more as a result? Do we know more about kind of what's out there archaeologically?
We're beginning to, and the idea was to, find the evidence of early Native American occupation, which may have predated, what was then considered the earliest Native cultural tradition in the Americas, the Clovis. So now we know there's pre-Clovis sites that predate 12,000, some of them going back to 20,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier. So the idea was to find one of those sites, you need to first identify an intact landform. That was the first phase. The second phase would be to run, side scan sonar and sub-bottom profiling, which basically, the sub-bottom gives you a sense of the topography beneath the sediments. And then the final phase, the third phase would be to ground truth those with cores, which we did. And the last phase would be to sample those landforms to, find some artifacts. So I've had a couple of grad students since then who have actually found some pretty early sites not as early as we were looking for, but they have found early sites off Martha's Vineyard and off New Hampshire that date between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago.
I think also it's so hard for people to picture the things that we're talking about and the history of this place. And so one thing that's great is fishermen are always finding stuff, right? They're always like down there, they're dragging nets around, they're just scrambling around on the banks. And so what they used to do is then, like, when they would find something they call Nick Bellantoni. So didn't some fishermen find a mastodon molar at one point?
Yeah, well, as Kevin was mentioning, with the rising sea levels, the coastline and the post-Pleistocene after the glaciers was farther out, much farther out. So one day I got a call at the office up at Yukon, and a fisherman had said, he was out in the Atlantic Ocean dredging his fish beyond Long Island Sound, and it's got something in his nets that he couldn't identify. It was rutted, pitted, and it looks like it had roots, and he wasn't quite sure what he was looking at. So I said, well, bring it up to Yukon, we'll take a look. And what it was we were able to identify it as a molar of a mastodon from the Ice Age. And I tried to explain to him what that was, and he said, what was the elephant doing in the ocean? And I had to explain to him when that elephant was there, that wasn't ocean, that was dry land, it was a coastal plain. It's just like, as Kevin said, he's looking for sites that might be associated with that go back very early. So it was, we gave him a lesson in sea rise levels to this day, but yeah, those even paleontological sites are out there.
So, so it's another thing to think about as you're, out there on your jet ski or something on Long Island Sound. There used to be mastodons walking around there. Where's the mastodon molar today? What happened to it? Is the mastodon molar part of the large Nick Bellantoni private collection of...
No. It ended up at the University of Connecticut. We do have one of the... our Museum of Natural History up at Yukon has the most complete mastodon ever recovered from the state of Connecticut. It's almost 2/3 of a complete animal. But no, it's part of the collections now.
So I think we have to take another break. When we come back, we're going to find out more about dugout canoes. We're going to tell you about all kinds of stuff like that. So stay tuned. We'll be back after the proverbial this. Hey, yeah, hooray, hooray.
Walk him along, John, carry him along.
I had built a ship 10,000 tons.
Carry him to his burying ground.
Where
I used for me. Walk him along, John, carry him along. Why I used for me. Carry him to his burying ground.
Not louder down with Isle and the wrong.
Walk him along, John, carry him along.
And every shellback should have song.
Carry him to his burying ground. Where I used for me. Walk him along.
Today's show was produced by Scott Breedy, with help from Betsy Kaplan, Larry Remming, Carolyn McCusker, and Jesse Steinmetz. The part of Bill Curry was played by Jacques Cousteau. And now, back to Colin.
We're back. We're live from the beautiful River Museum, the Connecticut River Museum in Essex, with this great audience here of thousands of people. And joining me, Nick Bellantoni, Emeritus Connecticut State Archaeologist, Christopher Goodwin, President and CEO of R. Christopher Goodwin and Associates, contracted by the State Historic Preservation Office to survey shipwrecks along the Connecticut coast, Kevin McBride, University of Connecticut Archaeology Professor, specializing in the Native American history of Connecticut, former Director of Research at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. So, Kevin, we talk about this kind of investigation, and we talk about Long Island Sound and the coastline and parts of the Connecticut River, but there's also quite a bit of stuff in lakes, particularly stuff dating back to Native American times. Tell us a little bit about what's been found in the way of dugout canoes and that sort of thing.
So Native people use two different kinds of canoes. For shallow water, dugout canoes are maybe 18 feet long, 12 feet long. Then they also had larger ocean-going canoes that were 80 feet long, could hold 40 people, and they were very different construction. They had prows fore and aft, and they had a bit of a keel. But it's not uncommon to find these dugout canoes in lakes and ponds throughout New England. Many have been found in Connecticut, and they're usually found by sport divers. And the reason they're in these ponds is they were often sunk by the owner, loaded with rock and sunk periodically so they wouldn't dry out. And for whatever reason, they're still there. So occasionally we've raised them. As Nick pointed out, it's an enormously expensive effort to conserve them. It's like, the wood is like rice paper. Consistency, but there are many that we know of that are still there that we just haven't bothered to bring them up.
Right. And these almost have to be fun. Well, Chris, you were saying that you can use all of the kind of equipment that you're talking about to go steamship, light ship, but you're not going to go canoe, right? It's not going to have any kind of signature on that.
Right, unless you're blind dumb lucky and you find one that's sticking up out of the sediment and has enough vertical relief so that you can see it.
So it might even be worth mentioning how painstaking you really do have to be. In other words, to get one of these canoes up and out, you have to effectively put it in water first before you bring it up. Is that right?
Yeah, you have to build a container, watertight container, and keep it in water. Otherwise, it'll basically just fall apart. You can imagine the weight of all that water. And you get on a flatbed truck, you take it to where you want to get it, and then you get a series of pumps, and you begin to, add plasticine solution to the water, and over time it eventually replaces the water in the cells, the wood cells, and with plastic, and it becomes firm enough to sort of move around.
We started this conversation out with a war story from Essex. Were these canoes also used as kind of battle transportation?
The large ones were.
Yeah.
There's plenty of, mention of them during the Pequot War of 1636-37, where they would, Pequots were using them for communication, for travel, for raiding. They attacked several English ships with them as well. They were pretty formidable craft.
Yeah. I should say, just to declare my own interest in this next topic. So my mother came from a town called Dana, Massachusetts. And Dana, Massachusetts was one of 4 towns that was identified, evacuated, and then flooded as part of the Quabbin Reservoir. And so my mother was fond of pointing out that her past was underwater, and I guess you could, back in the day, get a canoe and canoe over it and look down and see hitching posts and things like that. Not that my mother came from a time when there were just hitching posts, but and horses. So Nick, we've got a few of those in Connecticut too, right? Our recent past underwater. Where would that be found?
Yeah, no, basically what we've seen with the rise of reservoir systems and so forth, the flooding of rivers and so forth, actually inundating old colonial and historic towns, industrial centers. We've had situations where they've had to remove entire cemeteries to higher water in order to clear the way. But sometimes when the reservoirs are set lower, you can actually see, the ruins of some of the towns that were there.
What's at Barkhamsted Hollow? I know you know a lot about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Up and even up in Barkhamsted, the whole town was moved up there to make way for the reservoir system to provide water for the Hartford area. It's now become kind of an underwater archaeology type of endeavor, but we have whole towns that are completely submerged now.
When you say it's an underwater archaeology endeavor, once again, this is I assume a lot of this stuff is very protected at this point.
Oh, no, absolutely. It would take a good research design to want to go back in and to do anything. But, in many respects, parts of those communities are still preserved under the water. Yeah,
I'm reading from the exhaustive research of Scott Breedy, a ghost bridge in the Colebrook River Lake, an old metal bridge in the middle of West Thompson Lake, and a house at the bottom of Gardner Lake. And you'd have to really want that house back to want to pull it up out of the. But we don't
costly.
Don't go diving for any of those things either. This guy over here, just dive in Rhode Island. You can take their stuff, okay? All right, so it's time to do the Captain Cook thing.
Captain Kidd and the rest of them. Well, in my tenure as state archaeologist, people have shown me at least 7 sites where Captain Kidd supposedly had buried his treasure, and they range from everywhere from the Thimble Islands in Brantford to Charles Island and Milford, other points along the coast, even far inland as Voluntown and Hampton up in the Northeast Hills. Kidd was hired by the British government to actually go after pirates, so to speak, privateers, and supposedly had become one himself. And he always claimed he never had a treasure, but he was being wanted by the Brits, and he came through Long Island. He had friends in Milford, Connecticut, and that's why Charles Island was chosen. Gardiner's Island. Supposedly he dumped his treasure at various places and then was captured up in Boston, eventually hung in London. His body hung from at the mouth of the Thames River. He always, he basically told them at the end to prevent his being hung, if you go back with me, I'll show you where I buried all these things. But the British authorities wouldn't buy into it. They needed to make an example for pirates, and he became one. So anyhow, people have repeatedly come back saying that they have ideas about where Captain Kidd buried his treasure, but nothing was ever found. Charles Island would have been great because that's state property, and the governor would have been thrilled if we had been able to come up with something like that. But we've had even salvagers who have come up from Florida and other parts seeking permits from the State Historic Preservation Office and our office to conduct quote-unquote excavations looking for the treasure, but they never could satisfy us with a proper research design, so we never approved any of those. But if it's out there, it's still out there. But, you know, pirates spent their money.
Right.
And, you know, it's just like having a bank account and never using it. So I'm not big into treasures.
Right. I think there was at one point a plan to have tolls in the Connecticut River for the pirate ships. You know, get some of the money back that way. Just so they go under the gantry, they've got to pay. Chris, are you shaking your head because you don't want people to go around looking for treasure?
Let me just say that when you're talking about shipwrecks and other archaeological sites, these are the tangible vestiges of American history.
Right.
I think that amateur divers, have a tremendous role to play in helping to identify archaeological sites, shipwrecks that merit consideration to be put on the National or the Connecticut State Register of Historic Places so that they can be preserved for posterity. Not every shipwreck is going to be eligible for either of those two registers, National or Connecticut. But occasionally there are shipwrecks, and there are no doubt undiscovered shipwrecks out there that are transcendently important in terms of what they can tell us and what themes and events they illustrate that merit such preservation. Divers get in the water, they go looking for things, and they usually identify things of interest not only to their diving clubs, to each other, but occasionally they're going to stumble across something that is really, or swim across something that's really important. So I would urge close coordination when that happens with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office and with the state archaeologist, who then have the ability to take a look with the diver and see if this is something that's really important that merits preservation. I think that, you know, there's traditionally been some sort of a psychological separation between sport divers and archaeologists, perhaps related to piracy. But I think that there's a natural element of commonality there. These are people who actually appreciate American history, or prehistory in the case of the dugouts that Kevin was talking about. And I would think that the divers are kind of an exploratory arm of preservation should they choose to participate. And I know that the people, the state archaeologists and the people at the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office would be very interested in taking reports, asking folks to fill out a site form, giving them a location. And it's probable that those areas actually have NOAA imagery at least. So they've already got a geographic information system they can go to, they can pull it up and see what the heck it looks like. It may not be a named wreck. It may be one that's misidentified. It may be a wreck that's identified in the wrong position somewhere else. There are a lot of those out there because the technology's come a long way.
I mean, part of the problem, Nick, is that there are divers who want to find something and put it over their fireplace, right? So the last thing they're going to do is call you or anybody that they're supposed to call.
No, that's right. And and like Chris said, we've made efforts to coordinate with the diving community so we can work together and understand. One of the arguments I made to them is, you keep taking stuff out of the water, there's not going to be anything for your kids and your grandkids if they want to enjoy the hobby. But you're destroying a cultural resource that, like Chris said, it could be eligible for the National Register and very significant. I once had a case where working with a group of divers, it took me to one of their houses to show me some information that they had about a wreck that they had found. And the owner of the house huffed and puffed, and you could see he was going through some stress, and I was wondering what was wrong with him. And then finally he said, okay. And he brought me to his living room, and there was a bookshelf. And he pulled the side of the bookshelf out, and behind the bookshelf was all of these artifacts from a wreck that he had dove on and took. And I explained, I said, why was it behind the bookshelf? And he said, well, I was always afraid if the state archaeologist ever came to my house, he would take it. I said, well, what'd you show it to me for? But we tried to work closely with them. In fact, the wreck diving community is the one that helped us find a cornfield light point.
Yeah,
ship.
I mean, if you can get everybody working together, fishermen and divers and archaeologists and historical preservation groups, if everybody works together, it's great. If people decide to go off on their own, not so great. One thing I forgot to ask about is, I just mentioned fishermen, divers, people who find stuff. It hadn't occurred to me that pilots see things, but sometimes pilots going over the river will spot something in the river?
That's right. We had a pilot come to us many years ago, flying over the Connecticut River, and he saw the image of a vessel under the water. And this was in the East Windsor, upriver, in the East Windsor area. And so we went out there, coordinated with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, went out with a boat, and we were able to, it was very low, the water was only up to my waist. Because of OSHA, we had to wear life preservers. I was very embarrassed by the whole thing, but
the kind of thing that never happened to Jacques Cousteau, right? He jumped out of the boat and just kind of land waist deep in water. It doesn't look cool when you do that, right?
That's it. So we did the mapping that Chris talked about on a low level from technology that they use today, but we were able to map it, record it. We didn't remove anything from it, but we have it in our files as one of the shipwreck sites. But it was found because of aviation flying over.
Yeah. So we just talked about the importance of preserving all this stuff. I would assume, if it's possible, to kick that up a notch, Kevin, with Native American stuff. I would imagine, again, you don't want amateurs messing around with this. You don't want amateurs thinking that they found a dugout canoe at the bottom of some pond somewhere.
Generally not, but those amateur archaeologists are our biggest asset too. Mm-hmm. I mean, we wouldn't know half the things we know if people didn't come forward with what they found. What we usually do is encourage them, as Nick had mentioned, is to record it, get a GPS reading on it, take some photographs, send them in. But
and send them to who should they send them to?
The state archaeologist currently would be Brian Jones. Mm-hmm. I mean, I like to see it, so I send it to me too. But I'm not as organized as Brian is, so I mean, he's the repository for all that information. But it's sort of it's a dilemma sometimes. You don't want to encourage it, but you also need that. You also need people like that who can give you the information.
Right. It's like the mastodon tooth. Somebody's going to find that. The question is he going to know what to do with it? Is he going to do the right thing? But you don't want those observant people to go away, because there aren't enough of you guys to go find everything. All right. Well, on that exciting note, why don't we, first of all, we're going to have to wrap up because we're out of time, but could I have a big round of applause here for this terrific panel? Thanks so much. Nick Bellantoni, Christopher Goodwin, Kevin McBride. We can stick around here in Essex for a few questions afterwards, but also thanks to my terrific team who came down here and set up this thing. And also special thanks to the Connecticut River Museum for agreeing to host us too. This is if you haven't been here, this is just a beautiful place, and they've got a replica of the Adrian Block ship. Got this, the reason that we all speak Dutch and make chocolate and raise tulips here in Connecticut is because obviously Adrian Block found us and claimed us for the Netherlands. Anyway, thanks very much for coming out. Thanks for listening today, and we'll be back with another show on the next day.
Well, I was a lad in a fishing town. The old man said to me, You can spend your life, your jolly life, just sailing on the sea. You can search the world for pretty girls till your eyes are weak and dim. But don't go searching for a mermaid, son, if you don't know how to swim. 'Cause her hair was green as seaweed,